He checked into his own hotel, expecting business as usual, but what he overheard in the hallway stopped him cold. Whispers of fear, unpaid hours, and a manager no one dared to cross. What was happening behind closed doors? And just how deep did the corruption go? Stay tuned, because this CEO is about to uncover a truth no one saw coming. Richard Hayes stepped out of the black sedan and took a long breath of the cool New York evening air. The glass facade of the Hayes Grand Manhattan shimmered under the city lights. Standing tall against the skyline, it was one of his flagship properties, a jewel in the crown of his hotel empire. He should have felt a sense of pride looking at it. Instead, all he felt was a quiet unease. Over the past few months, whispers had reached his ears, rumors of cost-cutting measures that went beyond efficiency. Some employees had confided in anonymous surveys about unreasonable overtime, missing bonuses, and a shift in workplace culture that felt oppressive. No official complaints had been filed, no formal accusations, but Richard knew better than to ignore the silence. People didn't speak out when they were afraid. Tonight, he wasn't here as the CEO. He was just another guest. Inside, the grand lobby was as impeccable as ever. A polished marble floor reflected the soft glow of the chandeliers above, and a faint scent of fresh lilies lingered in the air. Everything looked perfect, too perfect. Richard approached the front desk. The young woman behind the counter forced a smile, her eyes flicking to the security camera behind him before greeting him. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to the Hayes Grand Manhattan." Checking in? Her voice was steady, but there was something off in her posture, stiff shoulders, fingers tapping lightly on the counter. Richard nodded, sliding a standard credit card across the desk. Reservation under Richard Coleman. The alias was a simple precaution. If the staff knew the owner was in the building, they would adjust their behavior. He wanted the truth, not a performance. The receptionist typed into the system, "Mr. Coleman, you're booked in our executive suite. Everything is prepared for you." "No special treatment," he interrupted. "I'd like to experience the standard service." She hesitated, then forced another smile. "Of course, sir." A bellhop rushed over, looking slightly overwhelmed as he grabbed Richard's suitcase. The boy, no older than 20, moved with urgency but without confidence. His uniform was neatly pressed, but there was a bead of sweat on his temple despite the lobby's air conditioning. As they walked toward the elevator, Richard caught sight of another worker near the entrance, juggling 3 sets of luggage alone. No second bellhop came to assist. That wasn't right. Inside the elevator, the young man cleared his throat. "Enjoy your stay, Mr. Coleman." Richard nodded, but his mind was already turning. The signs were small, but they were there. A workforce stretched too thin. Employees watching the cameras, not just the guests. Forced smiles hiding something deeper. When he reached his room, he was ready to let the first impressions settle. But then he heard the voices. Just beyond his door, 2 housekeepers were talking in hushed tones. Another double shift. One sighed, "I barely saw my kids this week. If we say anything, they'll just find a reason to fire us." The other whispered. Richard stopped in his tracks, his fingers tightening around the keycard. He had come to check on service quality. Now, he had a much bigger problem to solve. Richard spent the next few hours blending into the background, observing the rhythm of the hotel. From the plush leather chair in the lounge, he watched how employees moved, how they interacted, how the atmosphere shifted when management wasn't around. The first thing he noticed was the absence of upper management. There was no sign of an evening supervisor, no one checking in on staff efficiency or customer satisfaction. Everything seemed to run through a single man, the night manager. Employees walked with a certain stiffness, their eyes flickering toward the security cameras more than toward the guests. Housekeepers moved in and out of rooms at a hurried pace, some stopping in dark corners of the hallway to steal a moment of rest before pushing their carts forward. No one lingered, no one relaxed. Richard made small talk with a few employees when the opportunity arose. But the response was always the same, a polite, rehearsed smile, a carefully worded answer, and a quick excuse to leave. It wasn't just exhaustion in their faces. It was fear. At the hotel bar, Richard ordered a bourbon, neat. The bartender served it without a word, his expression vacant, as if working on autopilot. Just as Richard was about to take a sip, A voice behind him spoke up. Rough night? Richard turned to see a young man in a staff uniform, Daniel Carter. The front desk clerk from earlier. He had a weary look about him. But unlike the others, there was something hesitant in his eyes. Like he was debating whether or not to say something. Richard gave a small nod. Something like that. Thought I'd unwind a bit. Daniel let out a dry chuckle. You picked the wrong place for that. Richard set his glass down. Why's that? Daniel glanced around, lowering his voice. I used to work at the Midtown branch. It was different. Fair, you know? But here, he hesitated. Let's just say things aren't what they seem. People learn quick not to ask questions. Richard studied him carefully. Who's behind it? Daniel's jaw tightened. You already know the answer to that. Before Richard could press further, Daniel straightened, throwing a quick glance toward the far side of the lobby. I should get back to work. His voice was louder now, more controlled, the same polite professionalism as before. Richard followed his gaze and saw why. A man had entered the lobby, carrying himself with an air of casual authority. Mid-40s, sharp suit, confident smirk. The way he moved told Richard everything. This was a man who knew he was in control. Henry Wallace, the night manager. Richard decided to test the waters. As Henry passed by, he raised a hand to flag him down. Excuse me, Richard said. I had a few questions about the hotel's services. Henry turned, his expression already shifting into something calculated. Of course, sir. What can I help you with? Richard watched him closely. I was wondering if I could speak with a member of upper management. Just had some feedback I wanted to share directly. Henry's smile didn't reach his eyes. Unfortunately, management isn't available at this hour. If there's anything urgent, I can pass it along. Richard nodded slowly. I see. And who should I ask for during the day? There was the faintest flicker in Henry's expression, just a sliver of irritation. That would be Ms. Langston, our general manager. She handles most of the executive decisions. Richard tucked the name away for later. Appreciate it. Henry didn't move right away. He tilted his head slightly, as if assessing something about Richard. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and walked toward the staff corridor. A minute later, Richard caught sight of him in the reflection of a nearby glass panel, phone pressed to his ear. His face set in a scowl. Tell them to keep their mouths shut. Henry muttered. I don't want any more problems tonight. Richard exhaled through his nose. That was confirmation enough. Henry wasn't just enforcing hotel policy, he was running a system. Curious to see just how deep it went, Richard made his way to the security office. It wasn't hard to find. A discreet door near the back of the lobby, marked, authorized personnel only. He knocked, and a moment later, a young man in an IT staff uniform opened the door. Looking startled, can I help you? Richard gave him an easy smile. Hey, I was wondering if I could take a quick look at the security footage for the hallway outside my room. I thought I might have dropped something earlier. The man hesitated. I'd need manager approval for that. Henry Wallace's approval? Richard asked. The employee's expression tightened. Yes, sir. Richard glanced at the monitors behind him, where live feeds from the hotel played. But there were blank spots. Certain sections of the employee areas had their footage completely wiped. You seem busy, Richard said casually. Do the cameras glitch often? The IT worker's throat bobbed as he swallowed. I really can't say. That was all Richard needed to hear. As he stepped back into the hallway, the pieces started to come together. The erased footage, the missing overtime records, the employees too afraid to speak. This wasn't negligence. It was deliberate. When he reached his suite, he found a folded piece of paper slipped under his door. The message was short. Stay out of things that don't concern you. Richard turned the paper over in his hands, his jaw tightening. Whatever was happening in this hotel, someone was willing to threaten him over it. That meant he was getting close. Richard sat at the corner of the hotel's breakfast lounge the next morning, nursing a black coffee as he watched the hotel's employees move about their shifts. He had been careful the night before, making sure not to react too strongly to the threat left under his door. Fear was what they wanted. He wouldn't give it to them. Instead, he was doubling down. A threat meant that someone was scared that he was getting too close to something. And that only made him more determined to find out what was going on beneath the surface of his own hotel. He had spent years building the Hayes Grand Hotels on the foundation of fair wages, strong ethics, and a respect for the people who made his empire run. If something had rotted in his system, he intended to rip it out at the roots. That meant gathering more information. Over the next few hours, Richard played the part of an inquisitive guest. He asked the front desk clerks about staffing levels. He spoke with housekeeping, complimenting the cleanliness of his room while casually slipping in questions about their schedules. The responses were cautious. Some deflected, pretending not to understand the question. Others gave non-committal answers, their eyes darting away as if afraid someone might overhear. Then, just as he was beginning to think no one would talk, a young housekeeper made a mistake. Richard had caught her in the hallway near the service elevator, changing out a cart of linens. He had offered a polite thank you, and she had smiled back. But there was something tight about the way she held herself. When he asked about her shift, she hesitated for just a second too long. "If anyone finds out I'm talking to you, I'll lose my job." Richard kept his voice low and steady. "I won't let that happen. I just want to understand what's going on." The woman glanced around before speaking again. "Not here." Richard nodded. "Where?" She swallowed. "There's a cafe down the street. If you really want to know, meet me there in an hour." And just like that, he had his first real lead. An hour later, Richard sat at a small corner table in a quiet cafe a few blocks from the hotel. The young woman arrived minutes later. Still wearing her uniform, she looked nervous, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to burst in and drag her away. "Take a breath," Richard said. "No one knows you're here." The woman, who introduced herself as Sophia Martinez, shook her head. "That's what you think." She hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small voice recorder. Placing it on the table between them, "I recorded something last week," she said. "I wasn't going to do anything with it. I was scared. But, if you really want to know what's happening, you need to hear this." She pressed play. A voice, cold, controlled, filled the space between them. "If I hear you complain one more time, you're done here. Do you understand me? I'll make sure you never work in hospitality again. Your employment record will be gone. No one will touch you." Richard's grip tightened around his coffee cup. "Henry Wallace." Sophia nodded. "He's been doing this for months. He makes us stay late without overtime. He cuts our paychecks and tells us there was an accounting error. If we push back, we get fired." Richard exhaled through his nose, rage simmering beneath his skin. "Has anyone reported this?" Sophia gave a bitter laugh. "I tried. I sent an email to our." The next day, it was deleted from the system. And Henry called me into his office. He told me if I ever tried something like that again, I wouldn't just lose my job, I'd lose any chance at getting another one. Richard leaned back, mind racing. This wasn't just mismanagement, it was systemic. And if HR had ignored Sophia's complaint, that meant Henry wasn't acting alone. "Who else is involved?" he asked. Sophia hesitated. "I don't know for sure. But some of the older employees say that Henry has people protecting him. People higher up." That confirmed Richard's worst suspicions. He sat in silence for a moment, then met Sophia's gaze. "If I expose this, you'll be safe. I'll make sure of it." She let out a breath. "I hope you're right." Richard knew he needed more than just one testimony. He needed financial proof. That led him to Lucas Brennan. Lucas had been with the company for over a decade, a seasoned financial officer who prided himself on keeping clean books. If anyone had noticed discrepancies, it would be him. Richard found him in the administrative office behind the hotel's main lobby. When Lucas saw him walk in, his brows furrowed. "You're not just a guest, are you?" Richard shut the door behind him. "Not exactly." Lucas exhaled. "I knew something was wrong when I saw your name on the reservation list." "So, what's going on?" Richard didn't bother with pleasantries. "I think Henry Wallace has been manipulating payroll, cutting wages, erasing overtime. I need proof." Lucas ran a hand over his face. "I've been suspicious about payroll for a while. Some of the numbers don't add up. But I don't have full access to the original records, only upper management can see those." Richard crossed his arms. "What can you show me?" Lucas hesitated, then turned his monitor toward Richard. On the screen was a payroll report from last month. "Look here," Lucas said, pointing at a section of the document. This hotel's staffing costs are significantly lower than the others in the chain. But the number of employees remains the same. That means either hours are missing, or money is being funneled somewhere else. Richard's jaw tightened. Can you track where it's going? Not from here, Lucas admitted, but if I can get into the master financial database, I might be able to follow the trail. Do it, Richard said, and don't let Henry find out. Lucas gave a dry laugh. Trust me, I don't want to be on his radar. That night, as Richard returned to his room, something felt off. It wasn't just the way the hallway was eerily quiet. It was the feeling of being watched. He slowed his pace, listening. Footsteps, faint but deliberate. He turned his head slightly, catching sight of a hotel security guard standing near the elevators. The man had a phone in his hand, camera pointed directly at Richard. The moment their eyes met, the guard turned and disappeared down the corridor. Richard exhaled slowly. Henry knew, and that meant things were about to get a lot more dangerous. Henry Wallace had always prided himself on control. He ran the night shift with precision, ensuring that everything functioned exactly as he wanted. The staff feared him, and that was how he liked it. He didn't need to yell or make a scene. Just a subtle reminder of who held the power was enough. But something had changed. The employees were whispering more, their eyes darting toward the cameras, toward each other. It didn't take long for Henry to realize that someone was digging where they shouldn't. Someone was looking too closely. He didn't know who yet, but he intended to find out. That night, he called an emergency meeting with the night shift staff. It wasn't held in the usual employee lounge. Instead, he chose a dimly lit storage room in the back of the hotel, where there were no cameras, no guests nearby, and no chance of anyone recording. He stood in front of them, his expression calm but the weight of his words unmistakable. I'm hearing things, he began. Rumors, complaints. That's not what we do here. The room was silent. A few employees shifted uncomfortably. I don't need to remind you that loyalty is rewarded. But disloyalty? He let the word hang in the air. That comes with consequences. A tense stillness settled over the group. If anyone, Henry continued, his voice dropping lower, has been talking about things they shouldn't be, now's the time to come forward. No one spoke. Henry exhaled, nodding as if he had expected this response. Then let me be clear. If I find out someone has been spreading lies, they won't be working here much longer. And neither will their friends. One of the younger housekeepers, a girl named Maria, let out a barely audible breath. Henry's gaze snapped to her. Something to say? She quickly shook her head. Henry smiled. Good. The meeting ended, but the damage had been done. Fear had tightened its grip around the staff. That was how Henry kept things in order. Down at the hotel bar, Richard sat nursing a drink, pretending to be lost in thought. In reality, he was watching. Henry spotted him from across the room. The two men locked eyes. Richard had been expecting this. Henry strolled over, casual but deliberate. You seem to be enjoying your stay, Henry said, sliding onto the stool beside him. Richard gave a small smile. It's been interesting. Henry signaled the bartender for a drink. Interesting how? Richard took his time answering. I like to understand how things run. Always been curious about operations. Henry chuckled, shaking his head. Most people come here for the experience, not to study the staff. Richard swirled his glass. I guess I'm not most people. For the first time, Henry's mask slipped just slightly. The amusement in his eyes cooled. We don't usually have guests who take such an interest in our employees. He took a sip of his drink. And to be honest, we don't like it when they do. Richard held his gaze. That almost sounds like a warning. Henry smirked. Just a friendly piece of advice. People who go looking for problems tend to find them. Richard leaned back. I've always believed problems should be dealt with, not ignored. Henry studied him for a long moment, then set his drink down. Enjoy your stay, Mr. Coleman. Then, without another word, he walked away. Richard watched him go, knowing exactly what had just happened. Henry wasn't just suspicious anymore. He was certain. If Richard was going to act, it had to be soon. That night, Richard met with Lucas and Sophia in a small, unmarked office space near the administrative wing of the hotel. Lucas spread out the documents he had collected. Payroll inconsistencies, missing overtime records, and unauthorized expense reports. It's all here. Sophia placed her recorder on the table. And this is Henry threatening to erase my employment history if I spoke up. Richard exhaled. This is enough to prove that something's happening, but not enough to bring it down completely. Lucas nodded. I've been thinking about that. Henry isn't working alone. He has someone higher up protecting him. Which means if we take this to the board too soon, they could cover it up. Richard said, we need undeniable proof. Something they can't erase. Sophia hesitated. What if we go to the media? Richard considered it. It was risky. If the wrong people caught wind of it first, Henry could destroy more evidence before they had a chance to expose him. Not yet. Richard decided. We need one more piece. Later that night, Richard returned to his suite, tired but feeling like he was finally gaining ground. But when he slid his keycard into the door, it clicked open too easily. The lock had been tampered with. Richard stepped inside cautiously. The room looked the same, neat, untouched, but something was off. He moved toward the desk. The folder containing Lucas's payroll reports was gone. His phone vibrated in his pocket. A text. No number. Know when to walk away, or you'll lose more than papers. Richard clenched his jaw, gripping the phone tightly. This wasn't just about hotel policies anymore. It was war. Richard sat in his suite, staring at the empty space on his desk where the stolen documents had been. He wasn't surprised. Henry had made his move, but Richard wasn't the kind of man who panicked when things went sideways. If anything, he was more determined than ever. Losing the files was a setback, but it wasn't the end. The information was still out there, and he had more than one way to get it back. He called Lucas Brennan. The financial officer answered on the second ring, his voice tense. I need you to go over the books again. Richard said, find me something. Anything they might have missed. Lucas sighed. I was expecting your call. I've already started looking, but Henry must have someone covering his tracks. Some of the records I accessed before are gone. Richard leaned back in his chair. Then we go deeper. There's always a trail. Next, he reached out to Sophia Martinez. She was hesitant at first, nervous about what had happened to the documents. But Richard assured her that they weren't stopping. I need you to talk to more people, he said. Find others who are willing to speak up. Sophia hesitated. People are scared. Richard, Henry's already cracking down. Then we have to act fast, he said. We need leverage before he tightens his grip. Richard had a plan. Step 1. Make Henry think he had given up. If Henry believed the investigation had stalled, he'd get comfortable again. Step 2. Find more allies inside the hotel. Someone else had to know what was happening. Step 3. If all else failed, Richard wasn't afraid to go public. He had built a reputation in the industry. If Henry thought he could silence him, he was wrong. That evening, Richard went down to the bar for a drink, keeping his ears open for anything useful. And that's when she appeared. A woman slid onto the bar stool next to him, her dark eyes studying him carefully. You're causing quite a stir, she said. Richard glanced at her. That depends on who you ask. She extended a hand. Eleanor Park. He took it, shaking firmly. Richard Coleman. She smirked. You can drop the act. I know exactly who you are. Richard sipped his drink. Then I guess I should be asking who you are. Eleanor's smile faded. I used to work here. Head of hour. Until I asked too many questions. Richard straightened slightly. Henry? She nodded. He's not just making employees work unpaid overtime. He's pocketing money. A lot of it. And he's got help from higher up. Richard's pulse quickened. You have proof? Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a flash drive. I made copies before they erased my access. Internal emails, transaction records, supplier kickbacks. It's not everything, but it's enough to start burning down his house of cards. Richard took the drive, turning it over in his fingers. Why now? Eleanor's expression hardened. Because people like Henry don't stop. He thinks he's untouchable. I want to see him fall. Richard pocketed the drive. Then let's make that happen. Lucas called Richard early the next morning. I found something, he said. There are transactions Henry tried to bury, money being rerouted from payroll into personal accounts. Richard nodded. Eleanor confirmed it. She gave me records. Lucas let out a breath. Then we have him. But before they could move, Richard received an anonymous email. It contained screenshots of financial statements, bank transfers to offshore accounts. Henry's name was attached to every single one. Someone inside was helping them. Someone who hadn't revealed themselves yet. And Henry had no idea how much Richard now had. That night, before Richard could put the next step of his plan into motion, Henry made a move of his own. A staff-wide meeting was called, mandatory for all employees working that evening. Richard slipped into the back of the room, unnoticed, as Henry stood at the front with his arms crossed. "There's been a lot of gossip lately," Henry said, his voice calm but cold. "Some of you seem to think you can spread rumors without consequences." Silence filled the room. "Let me make this clear," Henry continued. "If I find out anyone has been speaking to people they shouldn't be, there will be no second chances." Richard clenched his fists. "And to show I'm serious," Henry said, turning toward the back of the room, "some of you will be placed on leave effective immediately. Starting with Sophia Martinez." A murmur rippled through the crowd as Sophia's face went pale. Richard knew exactly what was happening. Henry was cleaning house before Richard could expose him. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. Richard arrived at the hotel's executive office late in the afternoon, the golden hues of the setting sun casting long shadows through the tinted windows. He had requested a private meeting with Henry Wallace, and to his mild surprise, Henry had agreed without hesitation. That meant one of two things. Either Henry was arrogant enough to believe he was untouchable, or he was confident that nothing Richard said could truly threaten him. Henry's office was precisely what Richard expected. Sleek, modern furniture, expensive whiskey on a polished shelf, and a desk that was deliberately cleared of any paperwork. It was an office designed not for work, but for control. Henry leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips as Richard took a seat across from him. "I have to admit, Mr. Coleman, you've been quite an active guest. More involved than most." Richard met his gaze steadily. "I take an interest in the places I invest in." Henry chuckled, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Ah, so that's what this is about. A concerned investor. And here I thought you were just another guest with too much time on his hands." Richard didn't bite. He placed a folder on the desk between them, tapping it lightly. "I have some questions about your payroll structure." Henry's smirk faltered for the briefest moment before returning. "Payroll? I wasn't aware you were in charge of HR." Richard ignored the jab. "Employees working unpaid overtime, benefits that mysteriously vanish, terminations without proper cause, and more interestingly, financial transactions that don't match up with what's reported in the system." Henry exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head. "You've been busy." Richard tilted his head. "I'd say I've been thorough." For the first time, Henry's confidence wavered. It was a flicker, just a split-second hesitation in his expression, but Richard caught it. The mention of the transactions had struck a nerve. Henry recovered quickly, setting down his glass and leaning forward. "Let me be clear. I run this hotel the way I see fit. I don't answer to investors who think they can walk in and dictate how things work." Richard tapped the folder again. "That's where you're wrong. You do answer to me." Henry's smirk widened. "Is that so?" Richard leaned in slightly. "I'll give you a chance. Henry, fix it. Restore the employees' pay. Reinstate those who were fired unjustly. Clean up the books before I take this to people who won't be as patient as I am." Henry laughed. "And if I don't?" Richard's voice was calm, measured. "Then I will." For the first time in the conversation, silence stretched between them. Henry's fingers drummed lightly against the desk before he let out a slow breath and leaned back. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be." Richard didn't respond. He had said what he needed to. Henry studied him for a long moment. Then his demeanor shifted. His smirk returned. But there was something different this time, something calculated. "You know," Henry said, "we're both businessmen. We both know that success isn't just about numbers. It's about knowing when to push forward and when to step back. Maybe instead of fighting each other, we could come to an understanding." Richard remained still. "What kind of understanding?" Henry shrugged casually. "You want to see the numbers go up. I can make that happen. Profits keep rising. Shareholders stay happy. And you don't have to worry about the small details." Richard narrowed his eyes. "The small details, being your employees?" Henry exhaled, shaking his head. "This is how the industry works. You know that. You don't get to the top without a little efficiency. Richard felt a slow burn of anger settle in his chest. But he kept his voice steady. Let me make this simple for you, Henry. I'm not interested in your idea of efficiency. Henry's smirk faltered for the second time. He sat up straight, resting his hands on the desk. Be careful, Mr. Coleman. There are bigger things at play than you realize. You keep pushing, and you might not like what you find. Richard stood, sliding the folder across the desk. Consider this your only warning. Henry glanced at the folder but didn't reach for it. He was too busy watching Richard, his expression unreadable. Richard turned and walked toward the door. Just as he reached for the handle, Henry spoke again, his voice quieter this time. You think this ends with me? Richard paused. Henry leaned back, his smirk returning. You might want to ask yourself who you're really up against. Richard didn't respond. He opened the door and stepped out. Later that night, Richard sat in his suite, going over the documents Eleanor had given him when his phone buzzed. A message. No number. We need to talk. Urgent. Meet me at the rooftop bar in 10 minutes. Come alone. Richard frowned. He debated ignoring it, but something about it felt different. He grabbed his jacket and made his way to the rooftop. The bar was nearly empty. Just a handful of guests enjoying the nighttime cityscape. But as he scanned the area, no one approached him. No one seemed to be waiting. Then, his phone buzzed again. Another message. This isn't just business anymore. Walk away while you can. Richard turned, scanning the shadows beyond the bar area. He had the distinct feeling he was being watched. He exhaled slowly. Henry wasn't acting alone. And now, Richard was in deeper than he had realized. The morning unfolded with a sharp twist. Richard had barely finished his first cup of coffee when his phone buzzed with an urgent message from Lucas Brennan. Check the news. Now. Richard opened the financial news site. And there it was. A headline designed to do exactly what Henry wanted. CEO Richard Hayes is sabotaging his own hotel? The article was carefully written. Not an outright attack, but filled with insinuations meant to undermine him. It suggested he was overstepping his role, interfering with daily operations in a way that destabilized the staff. It painted him as an executive too obsessed with control, implying that his presence at the hotel was causing internal strife. What stood out most, however, were the so-called anonymous sources. A section of the article quoted unnamed employees complaining about Richard's involvement, claiming he was pressuring them with aggressive questioning, making them feel unsafe in their own workplace. It was a blatant attempt to discredit him, and it was effective. Within minutes, the article spread across industry circles, making its way to investors, executives, and board members. Henry had struck first. Richard put his phone down and exhaled slowly. Henry wasn't just playing defense anymore. He was coming for him. By midday, Richard was in a boardroom at the corporate headquarters of Hayes Grand Hotels. The meeting had been called on short notice, with several key board members present, including Arthur Jennings, one of the largest shareholders in the company and someone Richard had never quite trusted. Arthur leaned back in his chair, tapping a printed copy of the article. Care to explain what this is all about? Richard met his gaze without hesitation. A smear campaign. Arthur raised an eyebrow. That's a strong accusation. Do you have proof? Richard folded his hands on the table. I don't need proof to see what's happening here. Henry Wallace is corrupt. He's exploiting the staff, doctoring financial records, and now, he's trying to bury the truth by making me look like the problem. Arthur glanced at the other board members. These are serious claims. If you want us to act, you'll need to bring us something more substantial than suspicion. I will, Richard said evenly. Arthur sighed. Until then, I suggest you focus on bigger priorities. This company is built on stability. And right now, you're disrupting it. Richard recognized the tactic. Arthur wasn't rejecting his claims outright. He was stalling. That meant only one thing. Henry had allies inside the board. Richard left the meeting with a clear understanding. He was outnumbered for now. As he sat in his car outside headquarters, his phone rang. The number was blocked. He let it ring twice before answering. A woman's voice came through. Calm but urgent. You're fighting the wrong way, she said. Richard stiffened. Who is this? You don't need to know my name. What you need is evidence, real evidence. Not just payroll records, not just employee complaints. You need something that Henry can't deny or bury. Richard's grip on the phone tightened. And you have that? A pause. I know where to find it. Richard's heartbeat picked up. Go on. Henry recently completed a transaction. A big one. It wasn't just about skimming money from payroll, he moved something much larger. And if you follow the trail, you'll see the real picture. Richard didn't hesitate. Where do we meet? The woman's voice lowered. Somewhere private. I'll send you a location. The call ended. Richard leaned back in his seat, mind racing. Henry had made a mistake. And now, Richard was going to find it. Richard arrived at the small cafe just before midnight, taking a seat in a dimly lit corner where he had a clear view of the entrance. The place was nearly empty, save for a few late-night customers scattered around. A barista hummed softly as she wiped down the counter, seemingly unaware of the tension building in Richard's chest. Minutes passed before the door swung open, and a woman stepped inside. She moved with purpose but scanned the room cautiously before walking toward him. Natalie Moore. Richard had worked with her before, as the legal director for the company. She was sharp, methodical, and had a reputation for knowing how to protect the right people at the right time. Which meant one thing: if she was here, she had already decided Henry wasn't worth protecting anymore. Natalie slid into the seat across from him and placed a small flash drive on the table between them. You wanted proof. Here it is. Richard didn't touch it yet. Why now? She sighed, leaning back. Because Henry is reckless. He thinks he's untouchable, but he's sloppy. And because, she hesitated, then met his gaze. I know what's coming. If you don't stop him soon, this mess is going to get much bigger. Richard studied her carefully. What's on the drive? Natalie lowered her voice. A contract between Henry and a shell company. Officially, it's a third-party cleaning service for the hotel. But in reality, it's a front, fake invoices, falsified employee wages. The money should be going to real workers. But it's being siphoned into private accounts. Henry is taking his cut, and someone above him is letting it happen. Richard exhaled slowly. He had suspected financial fraud. But this was deeper than he thought. Who else knows about this? Natalie hesitated before answering. Not many people, but Henry has people inside the board who keep things quiet. Who? She shook her head. I don't know, but I do know Henry is planning one last transfer before he covers his tracks completely. If you don't stop him in the next 48 hours, the money is gone, and you lose any leverage you have. Richard nodded slowly. He now had a window to act. But there was still one problem. You worked with Henry for years, he said. Why should I trust you now? Natalie smirked slightly. You shouldn't. Richard appreciated the honesty. So what do you get out of this? I get to be on the right side when this all comes crashing down. She said simply. You're going to take Henry down. But you need someone who knows the system from the inside. I can help with that. Richard picked up the flash drive, turning it over in his fingers. And if you're lying? She leaned in slightly. Then you're already losing. Back at the hotel, Henry Wallace paced in his office, tension creeping into his usual confidence. Something felt wrong. Richard Hayes was still here, still asking questions, still moving in ways that made Henry uneasy. And now, there were whispers. One of his assistants had flagged unusual activity in the company's database. Someone had accessed sensitive financial records, files that should have been locked away. It wasn't an external breach. It was someone from the inside. Henry clenched his jaw. Someone was betraying him. He grabbed his phone and made a call. Lock everything down, he ordered. Check every email, every login. I want to know who's talking. The moment he ended the call, another message popped up on his screen. No name, just a simple line of text. You're running out of time. Henry stared at it for a long moment before shutting off his phone. If someone wanted a fight, they were about to get one. Richard sat in his hotel suite, the weight of the next 48 hours pressing down on him. Henry was close to moving the last of his stolen money. And once it was gone, so was any chance of bringing him down. There was no more time for careful planning. This was now a race against the clock. He gathered his closest allies in a private meeting. Lucas Brennan, the financial officer who had uncovered the payroll fraud, Sophia Martinez, the housekeeper who had risked everything to speak up, and Natalie Moore, the legal director whose motives remained unclear. Richard laid out the plan. Lucas would monitor the hotel's financial systems for any attempts to move money offshore. If Henry initiated a transfer, Natalie would use her legal authority to freeze the transaction under suspicion of financial misconduct. Meanwhile, Sophia would continue gathering testimonies from employees, strengthening their case. But before they could set things in motion, a complication arose. A contact inside the corporate office tipped Richard off that Henry had scheduled a private meeting with Arthur Jennings, one of the most influential members of the board. If Arthur continued backing Henry, the board could turn against Richard before he had the chance to present his evidence. If Richard was going to win this fight, he needed to get to Arthur first. That evening, Richard arrived at an exclusive business club in Midtown Manhattan, where Arthur was known to frequent. The setting was polished, discreet, the kind of place where deals were made behind closed doors. Away from prying eyes, Arthur was seated at a corner table, a glass of scotch in hand, his posture relaxed but his expression unreadable. Richard sat across from him, not bothering with pleasantries. "We need to talk." Arthur took a slow sip of his drink. "I assume this is about Henry." Richard placed a folder on the table. "It's about more than Henry. It's about the future of this company." Arthur glanced at the folder but didn't reach for it. "I've already heard Henry's version of things. He says you're overstepping, stirring up chaos, that you're trying to clean house for your own benefit." Richard didn't blink. "That's exactly what he wants you to believe." Arthur exhaled, setting his drink down. "You have proof?" Richard opened the folder, revealing financial statements and transaction logs. Payroll manipulation, money being funneled through fake vendors, offshore accounts linked directly to Henry. For the first time, Arthur's composure wavered. He leaned in, scanning the documents. Richard pressed forward. "If you keep protecting Henry, when this collapses, you'll be tied to it. The media won't just come for him, they'll come for anyone who stood in the way of the truth." Arthur remained silent for a long moment. Then, finally, he closed the folder and sat back. "Henry has become a liability," he admitted. Richard watched him carefully. "Then stay out of my way." Arthur nodded. "I won't stop you, but you'd better finish this quickly." Back at the hotel, Henry Wallace was beginning to sense that the walls were closing in. He had been expecting Arthur's call, a confirmation that the board would support him. Instead, there was silence. That alone was enough to tell him things weren't going his way. He needed to act before Richard made his next move. Henry called a press conference, positioning himself as the victim of a corporate power struggle. He stood before a group of reporters, his expression controlled as he painted a picture of a CEO overreaching, disrupting hotel operations, and targeting loyal executives. To bolster his claims, he produced falsified documents, fabricated reports suggesting that Richard had been restructuring the company for his own gain. By morning, the headlines were everywhere. Power struggle at Hayes Grand Hotels. Is CEO Richard Hayes overstepping? It was a public relations disaster. Richard watched the coverage unfold on the news, his jaw tightening. Henry had played his strongest card, turning the media against him. But Richard had one more card to play. As Richard strategized his next move, something else went wrong. Lucas Brennan had gone silent. Calls went unanswered, emails bounced back, and when Richard accessed the company's financial system, he noticed that several key documents had been erased. Someone had gotten to Lucas. Had he betrayed them, or had he been forced into silence? Either way, Richard knew one thing. This was the final stretch. Either he took Henry down now, or he lost everything. Richard stood at the head of the long, polished boardroom table, facing the most powerful figures in Hayes Grand Hotels. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the moment pressing down on every person in the room. Henry Wallace sat across from him, his expression controlled but his fingers tapping lightly against the table, an unconscious tick that betrayed his unease. The board members, including Arthur Jennings, watched the unfolding confrontation with careful neutrality. But Richard knew the moment of decision was near. He took a breath and placed 3 documents on the table. "I assume you've all seen the media reports," he said evenly. "Henry has been busy spreading misinformation, trying to turn this into a battle of egos. But this isn't about egos. It's about corruption." He slid the first document forward. "This is a financial report showing discrepancies in payroll expenses, Money was siphoned through a fake vendor, one that, as you'll see, has direct ties to Henry Wallace. He placed the second document on top of it. This is a sworn affidavit from multiple employees, confirming that they were forced into unpaid overtime under threats of termination. Finally, he pulled out his phone and hit play. The room filled with Henry's voice, captured in the recording Sophia Martinez had provided. If you don't like the way things are run, you can leave, but if you start talking, I'll make sure you don't work in this industry again. Silence. Henry shifted in his seat. But the damage was done. Arthur Jennings, who had remained noncommittal for so long, finally exhaled and sat back. This is serious, he admitted, and it's enough to warrant immediate action. Richard met his gaze. Then let's take action. Henry forced a chuckle. This is absurd. A setup. You think you can just waltz in here, throw some papers on the table, and destroy my career? One of the board members, a woman in her 60s with a sharp gaze, interjected. We don't think, Henry. We know. Another member nodded. This is enough to remove you. And if these documents hold up in an external audit, there could be legal consequences as well. The decision was made. Henry's confidence cracked, his posture stiffening. You can't do this. Arthur leaned forward. Watch us. The board voted unanimously. Henry Wallace was fired on the spot. Security was called in to escort him out. He threw Richard one last venomous glare before storming from the room. But Richard wasn't thinking about Henry anymore. He was thinking about what came next. Hours later, Richard sat alone in his office, staring at his phone. He had expected the fight with Henry to be the end of this ordeal. But something didn't sit right. Then his phone buzzed. An unknown number. He hesitated before answering. Richard Hayes. A familiar voice came through the line. Lucas Brennan. Richard, I need to talk to you. Richard straightened. Lucas? Where the hell have you been? Lucas's voice was quiet, cautious. They got to me. Richard, they threatened my family. I had to disappear. Richard's grip tightened on the phone. Who? A pause. You think Henry was the mastermind behind all this? He was just a pawn. Richard's pulse quickened. Then who's pulling the strings? Lucas took a slow breath. Someone higher up, someone inside the company. The line went dead. Richard set his phone down, his mind racing. Henry was gone, but the real fight was just beginning. Richard arrived at the secluded estate just before sunset. The invitation from Arthur Jennings had been unexpected, but it was the location that raised red flags. This wasn't a standard board meeting at the corporate headquarters. This was something else, something off the books. The house was an architectural masterpiece, modern yet imposing, designed to impress and intimidate. A silent butler led him through dimly lit hallways to a grand sitting room where Arthur was waiting. But Richard's eyes immediately locked onto the other man in the room. Michael Whitmore, the chairman of the board, the most powerful figure in the company. Richard had always known Whitmore as a man who preferred to stay in the background, pulling strings without ever stepping into the light. If he was here, it meant one thing. This wasn't just about Henry anymore. This was about the system that allowed Henry to exist in the first place. Richard took a seat across from them, keeping his expression neutral. I assume this isn't a social visit. Whitmore gave him an easy smile, the kind that never quite reached his eyes. No, Richard, it's about the future of this company. Arthur poured himself a drink but said nothing. He wasn't in control here, Whitmore was. Richard leaned back. Then let's get to the point. Whitmore folded his hands together. You did well exposing Henry. A bit theatrical, perhaps, but effective. The problem is, you're looking at this the wrong way. You think Henry was the disease when he was merely a symptom. Richard didn't react. He had expected as much. Whitmore continued, his tone calm, almost patronizing. Every system needs stability. Richard, the things Henry did, cutting costs, streamlining expenses, they weren't mistakes. They were necessary adjustments. Richard exhaled slowly. Necessary adjustments? You mean stealing from employees? Threatening livelihoods? Manipulating records? Whitmore shrugged. That's a dramatic way of putting it. But tell me this, before you started digging, were we profitable? Richard didn't answer. He knew where this was going. Whitmore smiled. Exactly. You think you're fixing something broken. But all you're doing is disrupting an ecosystem that works. And now, you've left us with a problem. One that I'm here to fix. Richard's patience was wearing thin. And how do you plan to fix it? Whitmore leaned forward. You stop digging. You let this go. In return, you'll have full control over the hotel division. No interference. No oversight. You'll be able to run it exactly as you see fit. Richard let out a dry laugh. You want me to look the other way? Whitmore's smile never wavered. I want you to be smart. For a long moment, silence filled the room. Arthur shifted uncomfortably in his chair. But Whitmore remained perfectly still, waiting. Richard finally stood. I'm not Henry. Whitmore sighed, shaking his head. That's a shame, Richard, because now, you've put yourself in an unwinnable position. Richard turned to leave, but Whitmore's final words stopped him. Watch closely. You'll see who really holds the power here. The next morning, the news broke. Hayes Grand Hotels in crisis. Investors lose confidence in leadership. Stock prices plummeted. Analysts speculated about instability in the company. Prominent investors, many with ties to Whitmore, began calling for a vote of no confidence in Richard's leadership. It wasn't just an attack. It was a coordinated strike. Richard sat in his office, watching the financial reports roll in. Whitmore had made his move. And now, Richard had only one chance to make his own. Richard sat at the head of the conference table in a private meeting room far from corporate headquarters. The walls were lined with soundproof panels, and the only light came from a dim overhead fixture. Across from him sat Lucas Brennan, Natalie Moore, and Sophia Martinez, his last remaining allies. They had less than 24 hours before the board vote. If Richard failed, he wouldn't just lose his position, he would lose the company to Michael Whitmore, a man who had spent years manipulating the system from the shadows. He turned to Lucas first. Tell me you found something. Lucas slid a tablet across the table. It took some digging, but we found a money trail leading to a subsidiary in the Cayman Islands. Millions of dollars funneled through shell companies, all tied back to Whitmore. Richard studied the data. The numbers were precise, the transactions meticulously crafted to avoid scrutiny. But Lucas had exposed the weak link, a pattern of deposits and withdrawals that pointed directly to Whitmore's involvement in corporate fraud. This is it, Richard muttered. This is what we need to take him down. Natalie leaned forward. Even with this, we still have a problem. You can't just drop this on the board and expect them to act. Whitmore has spent years securing loyalty. You need to control the narrative before he does. Sophia nodded. If you want people to listen, you have to show them the real consequences of what's happening. The employees who lost their wages. The ones who were threatened. Let them speak. Richard exhaled. They had the financial proof. They had the legal framework. Now, they needed the human side, the voices that Whitmore had silenced. Get them ready, he said. We go public before Whitmore does. Hours later, just as Richard was finalizing his plan, the headlines hit. Richard Hayes accused of corporate misconduct, internal investigation launched. He stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. Michael Whitmore had struck first. The article was written to create doubt, not outright accuse. It suggested that Richard had manipulated financial records for personal gain, that his leadership had caused instability in the company, that investors were losing confidence. Within minutes, calls from reporters flooded his office. Questions about irregularities, about whether he had been acting in his own self-interest. Whitmore hadn't just attacked Richard's credibility, he had turned the investigation onto him. Natalie's phone buzzed. She checked the message and her expression darkened. It's worse than we thought. The board has scheduled the vote for tomorrow morning. They're accelerating it. Richard's hands clenched into fists. Whitmore wasn't giving him time to fight back. He was closing in for the kill. Richard looked at his team. We don't have time to play defense. Lucas met his gaze. Then we take the fight to him. Richard stared at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office. The weight of the next 12 hours pressing down on him. The vote was imminent, and the tide was shifting against him. Whitmore had thrown every possible obstacle in his way: media smears, boardroom manipulation, a rigged internal investigation. Natalie paced the room, phone in hand, scanning the latest headlines. They're framing this as corporate instability. Investors are panicking. Some board members are already considering backing Whitmore just to restore confidence. Lucas sat at the conference table, tapping furiously on his laptop. If they vote him out before we release the evidence, they'll bury everything. We need to act now. Richard exhaled. The time for careful maneuvering was over. He had one move left, and it had to be bold. He turned to Lucas. Get everything ready. We're taking this public. An hour later, a press conference was set. Cameras lined the room. Journalists murmured, waiting for the man at the center of the biggest corporate scandal in years to speak. Some were expecting a desperate attempt to salvage his reputation. Others believed he would announce his resignation. Instead, Richard stepped up to the podium and placed a thick file on the lectern. This company was built on trust, on values, and today, I stand here to tell you that trust has been violated, not by me, but by those who believe they can manipulate the system for their own gain. He clicked a remote, and the screen behind him lit up with financial records. These transactions, hidden through offshore accounts, led directly back to Michael Whitmore. The room went silent. Millions of dollars siphoned from corporate funds. Employee wages stolen under the guise of operational efficiency. A system of corruption built not just by one man, but by an entire network designed to protect itself. Richard continued, his voice unwavering. This is no longer about a power struggle in a boardroom. This is about whether we allow corporate greed to go unchecked. About whether this company, this industry, continues to operate in the shadows or finally stands for the values we claim to uphold. He turned to the journalists. And now, I leave it to you to ask the real questions. The room erupted into chaos. Reporters shouted over each other. News stations cut their broadcasts to go live. The story was no longer in Whitmore's control. Inside his penthouse office, Michael Whitmore stood in front of a television screen, watching Richard's broadcast with a blank expression. One of his closest advisors rushed in. We need to respond. Damage control. Whitmore held up a hand. Not yet. The advisor hesitated. Sir, he's naming you directly. The board will. Whitmore turned, his calm exterior masking the storm underneath. The board will do what's best for them. And if that means cutting me loose, so be it. He took a seat, steepling his fingers. But Richard just made himself a very public target. That night, Richard sat in his office. Exhausted but resolute, he had won the first battle. Whitmore's hold on the board was crumbling, and a formal investigation was inevitable. Then his phone buzzed. An unknown number. A simple text. Don't think you've won. The system always finds a way back. Richard read the words twice, then locked his phone and leaned back in his chair. He had taken down Whitmore, but something bigger was still out there. The boardroom was silent as Michael Whitmore sat at the far end of the long mahogany table. His expression unreadable. For years, he had controlled this space, dictated its direction with the quiet authority of a man who never needed to raise his voice. But today, the power was slipping from his grasp. Richard sat across from him, his hands folded on the table, calm but unwavering. Around them, the other board members shifted uncomfortably. The evidence against Whitmore had become undeniable. The financial discrepancies, the offshore accounts, the siphoning of employee wages, every piece of it now laid bare. Arthur Jennings cleared his throat, his voice neutral but firm. The matter before us is clear. We must vote on Michael Whitmore's position within this company. Effective immediately. There was no discussion, no debate. The votes were cast, and one by one, the board members turned against their former leader. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. When the final vote was read aloud, confirming his removal, he simply exhaled. Then, he stood and adjusted the cuffs of his suit. His eyes met Richard's, and a small, knowing smirk played at his lips. You think you've won? His voice was almost amused. You haven't changed anything, Richard. You've just removed a face from the system. The machine keeps running, with or without me. Richard didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Whitmore gave one last glance around the room, then strode toward the exit, his footsteps echoing through the chamber. Outside the conference room, reporters had already gathered, waiting for an official statement. News had spread fast. Michael Whitmore, one of the most powerful figures in the industry, had fallen. But as Richard walked past the sea of cameras and flashing lights, he felt no sense of victory. Natalie Moore caught up to him. It's done, she said, her voice quiet, But they put conditions on you, didn't they? Richard nodded. They'll let me stay on as CEO. But with restrictions. They don't want me digging any deeper. Natalie sighed. They're protecting themselves. The board doesn't want another Whitmore. But they don't want a revolution either. He looked up at the towering skyscrapers surrounding him. The city was alive, its heartbeat steady, indifferent to the battles fought in its boardrooms. Sophia Martinez, standing near the entrance, caught his eye. She had risked everything to tell the truth. But how many more like her were still trapped? Lucas Brennan had uncovered the financial rot. But how much more of it remained hidden? Whitmore had been right about one thing. This wasn't about a single man. It was about an entire system. Richard took a deep breath. He had won today, but the war was far from over. And he wasn't ready to walk away. The coffee shop was tucked into a quiet corner of Manhattan, away from the usual noise of the city. Richard sat at a small table near the window, watching the rain drizzle onto the pavement. Across from him, Eleanor Park stirred her coffee, her expression unreadable. "You did it," she said finally, setting her spoon down. "Whitmore is gone." Richard nodded, but there was no sense of victory in his posture. That was just one battle. The system remains. Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder, placing it on the table between them. "Then maybe it's time you see how deep the system really runs." Richard hesitated before opening it. Inside were pages of financial transactions, internal memos, and records of offshore accounts, documents that traced the flow of money far beyond Henry Wallace or Michael Whitmore. These weren't just acts of corporate greed. This was something larger. "These transactions," Richard murmured, flipping through the pages. "Some of them go back nearly a decade." Eleanor nodded. "Because this isn't just about Whitmore. He was convenient, replaceable. But the real decision makers?" She leaned in, lowering her voice. "They've been running this game for a long time. And they won't let one man change that." Richard exhaled, staring down at the documents. His gut had told him from the beginning that this was bigger than just one corrupt executive. But seeing the proof in front of him made the weight of it settle differently. "You brought this to me," he said. "Why?" Eleanor smiled, though there was no amusement in it. "Because I tried to fight them once. And they buried me. You might be the only one left who still has a chance." Back in his office later that night, Richard sat alone, the city lights stretching out beneath him. The folder from Eleanor lay on his desk, unopened since their meeting, but he didn't need to look at it again. He already knew what it meant. A choice. He had done what he set out to do, exposed corruption, taken down the men responsible, restored balance within his company. He could stop now, claim victory, and walk away with his legacy intact. Or he could keep going. But if he did, he wouldn't just be fighting corporate greed anymore. He would be going up against something larger, more powerful, something that wouldn't hesitate to erase him the moment he became a real threat. Richard reached for the folder, flipping it open once more. He had made his decision. Richard sat in his office, the weight of the past weeks pressing down on him. The battle against Michael Whitmore had been won, but victory felt hollow. The documents from Eleanor still sat on his desk, a silent reminder that he had only scratched the surface. He was no longer just a CEO managing a luxury hotel chain. He was now a man standing at the edge of something far bigger, something dangerous. He picked up his phone and made 3 calls. Lucas Brennan answered first. "Are you sure about this?" the finance expert asked, his voice cautious. "We could just walk away. Enjoy the win. If we stop now, we let them rebuild." Richard replied. "I need you to track every hidden transaction in those files. Find out where the money is really going." Next was Natalie Moore. "If you're asking me to take this to the authorities," she warned, "you need to be ready for what happens next. These people don't play fair." "I'm not taking it to them yet," Richard said. "I need a legal angle. Something they can't ignore when the time comes." Finally, he called Eleanor Park. She didn't need convincing. "I'll keep watching from the inside," she said simply. "But Richard, you need to understand what you're up against. They see you now, and they don't make the same mistake twice." Richard leaned back in his chair. He had a team, a strategy, but he was under no illusion. This was not the same fight he had won before. The envelope arrived that evening, slipped under his office door without a sound. No return address, no markings, Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in plain black ink. "We know what you're doing. There won't be a second chance." Richard exhaled slowly, staring at the words. Beyond the glass windows, the city stretched out before him, its skyline glowing in the night. He had been given an option: walk away while he still could. But he already knew the answer. There was no walking away from this. Power isn't just about making profits, it's about standing up when no one else will. Richard Hayes walked into his own hotel as a stranger and left as a man who refused to ignore the truth. But if one CEO can expose corruption, how many others are turning a blind eye? What would you do if you uncovered a secret like this? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Undercover Truths for more eye-opening stories. Because sometimes, the truth hides in plain sight.